Hey, gang, this week's episode is brought to you by Royal Retros, the king of throwbacks. Hey, if you're looking for teams and leagues that don't exist anymore, but you'd like to remember them in high-quality jersey or uniform format, hey, some of those teams were legendary. Some of them were disasters, but they all live at Royal Retros. Check them out. RoyalRetros.com. Use that promo code SEATS for 10% off all of your purchases. Check them out now. And now, check out this episode.
We're talking about the guy who found the jump shot or something?
Do you know who that guy is?
No.
I don't know, because,
I'm a millennial, so I just thought the jump shot was just a part of the game.
The sport of basketball has seen many names shape its rich history, but there's one name that escapes memory.
That was my jump shot.
When I watched Kenny Sailors, it actually blew me away.
If you saw Kenny Sailors play, you saw the jump shot.
Ken Sailors of Wyoming sinks this one.
I mean, it really looks like a Russell Westbrook pull-up now.
I mean, he was moving and shooting off the dribble. In some ways, he was playing a different game. Visionary, man, way ahead of his time.
We don't realize that there was a time there was no jump shot.
No one shot that up until then like he did.
Unless you're from Wyoming, chances are you don't know the story of Kenny Sailors and the jump shot.
Kenny was one of the best-known basketball players in America. He had everything going for him in terms of basketball stardom.
the trail got lost after he spent another lifetime in another world.
From a world standpoint, they'd probably say I had a calling to play basketball.
He just constantly used the sport to influence people's lives.
He gave us personal confidence to become a lot of things that would never have happened otherwise.
A lot of things I've done that's probably more important than that jump shot.
He's an American original.
How many basketball players we can think about actually did something to forever change the game? Forever.
For where would basketball be without Kenny Sailors and what is known today as the jump shot?
His story has to be told because he was an influencer before his time.
I hope to have as much of an impact as Kenny did.
That shot lasted through generations and generations, and he's made it to the Warriors, to Steph Curry, the greatest shooter ever played.
Behind the back, fires.
I can't play above the rim, so the jump shot is my only weapon.
You can go anywhere in the world, and they're shooting Kenny's shot.
Where is Kenny Sailors?
People just forgot who he was.
He disappeared for so long.
Sometimes history gets lost. And that's what happened with Kenny Sailor's story. History lost his story.
Welcome to Good Seats Still Available, a curious little podcast devoted to exploring what used to be in professional sports. Here's your host, Tim Hanlon.
Ooh, I'm getting goosebumps. How are you, everybody? It's Tim Hanlon. It's Good Seats Still Available, the curious little podcast that's devoted to what used to be in professional sports. And it's hoops time here on the big show, and always happy to dribble back into basketball. And this is a really intriguing story about something that I think most fans of the game today don't realize the background of, the story behind. The setup is pretty straightforward. That came from a movie that came out in 2020, executive produced by Steph Curry. It's called Jump Shot, the Kenny Sailors story. It is literally the story of what we're going to be talking about today with our guest, Debbie Sorensen, the author of the new book about the life and times of the guy named Kenny Sailors, who was, by all estimation, the locus of the beginnings of the chief instigator behind the evolution of this thing called the jump shot, which in the 1940s, when basketball was still kind of getting its professional sea legs, certainly a very substantial activity at the collegiate level, this idea of a jump shot, shooting above one's head, sort of two-handed and then into a sort of a one-handed wrist snap kind of thing, and extending oneself in the air, jumping to do that at the same time, was a relatively novel thing. There were a handful of players that were kind of playing around with sort of different ways versus, say, a set shot, like the old Bob Cousy thing, or planted on the ground. But the idea of jumping in the air and at the same time extending one's shot above one's head, sort of in a powerful move, that would guide the ball closer to the rim or to the backboard, as it might be. Kenny Sailors is this extraordinary story and guy who essentially made it happen and became almost synonymous with the acceptance of that shot, a novel at the time in the late 40s, early 1950s. But in 1943 at Madison Square Garden at the NCAA basketball championships, there was this thing called a leaping one-hander, as it was called in the papers at that time, now known as the jump shot. And the guy behind it was Kenny Sailors, playing for the University of Wyoming basketball team, and was helping lead them to a 1943 championship, for example. Most outstanding player he was. He was a consensus All-American a couple of times, and went on to, in the late 40s, early 50s, a career in the professional ranks that gets our attention. And we'll talk about that with Debbie in a few minutes as we talk about the Kenny Sailors story. But there are just is a whole panoply of teams that just wet our whistle, shall we say, such as the 1946-47 Cleveland Rebels, a team we have not discussed yet, part of this Basketball Association of America. You remember, one of the two tributaries that combined to create the NBA in 1949-1950. The Cleveland Rebels, of course, he played a game, Kenny did, for the BAA version of the Chicago Stags, and then played 2 games for the BAA version of the Philadelphia Warriors. And then by the end of the 1947 season, or substantially the 1947 season, and 2 seasons thereafter, was part of this team called the Providence Steamrollers of the Basketball Association of America. We know that the merger happened in 1949. 1949-50 season was the first season of the newly formed National Basketball Association, the NBA. And Sailors found himself with the Denver Nuggets, the original version thereof, not the one that we know today, but the original team that was part of the competitive to the BAA National Basketball League. And that was the league that the Nuggets were in prior to the 1949-50 season when Sailors joined. And then as the NBA took off and as Sailors continued his play, we wound up in playing for the Boston Celtics in 1950, and then for the rest of that season, 50-51, the Baltimore version, Bullets. Again, the now Washington Wizards. That is a direct connection. So lots of early pro basketball stuff there, and Ken Sailors was a major part of those evolutionary years. And again, the collegiate experience with Wyoming, a nationally attributed development of this thing called the jump shot, which became in vogue by that time. And a really interesting story. He left literally at the top of his game in 1951 after playing for the Bullets that season, and went back to Wyoming. And as we'll hear in our conversation with Debbie Sorensen, kind of moved on from basketball to greater things that were of higher calling, shall we say, in not only in Wyoming, but also in Alaska, and coaching and all that kind of stuff. And Sailors died in 2016. He at the ripe old age of 95, a life well and deeply lived. And we're going to get into all of that. The inventor, the originator of the jump shot, Kenny Sailors, his story coming up in a second with Debbie Sorensen on our big show here. And let's see, the movie is available now. I think it's on Prime, on Amazon Prime. We'll have a link to it on our website at goodseatsstillavailable.com. Just search up this episode 370 with Debbie Sorensen. You'll find a convenient link to that for you to stream it. And of course, you can also get a copy of the book that Debbie has just put out. That, of course, is called Beyond the Jump Shot, The Elevated Life of Kenny Sailors. Just came out in paperback back in August. That is published by Clovercroft Publishing, and we'll have a link to that as well on our website at goodseatsstillavailable.com. But before you get that book and before you watch this movie, how about a listen to this interesting story? And it was a pleasure to have Debbie on the show. Geez, we did this conversation back in September, but I'm finally able to get it out to you now. I think you'll find it really intriguing. And I learned a ton. I didn't know anything. I knew nothing about the story of Kenny Sailors. And, well, if you haven't, sit back and please, as always, enjoy. Let's start from the start. Give our audience a bit of a sense of who you are and a little bit of your background professionally or otherwise. And importantly, what is your connection to this guy that we're going to be talking about, Ken Sailors?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question and one I get all the time. So I'll start off with that first. My connection with Ken Sailors was in 1978. My husband worked for the Bureau of Land Management, and we moved to a place in the interior of Alaska called Glen Allen. And so we happened to live between two villages nearest to Gakona. And it happened that Kenny and Marilyn Sailors were neighbors in the area. They found out that we were new to this place, and they invited us to a potluck. And we went and got to meet them. And then they invited us to a native chapel down the road. So we went. And we had other occasion to interact with them. And I ended up going to a Bible study at their place and had us over for meals a few times. And when we had twin boys that were born up there, and they were just very, very kind and generous and encouraging neighbors. And when we'd go to visit, Marilyn and I'd go sit somewhere, and Kenny and Russ would go somewhere, and then they would visit. So that's how we got to know them. And we moved back outside, as they say, to the lower 48, and we kept in touch for a number of years, and then life has a way of going on. And when we returned to Montana from Alaska, we raised our family, and I have background in, I was state director of education for the Montana Farmers Union and was a teacher also. Now our boys are raised, and I was pondering, what could I do to encourage people? And I gone to the young adult section in our library and was poking around and just kind of pondering what was there. And as I was leaving, the name Kenny Sailors went through my mind. And I thought, well, that's interesting. So when I came home, I caught up with a few people from Alaska that I still had phone numbers for, because I didn't know if Kenny was dead or alive by that time. And he had died in 2016, but I got a phone number for his son, Dan, who lives in Alaska yet. And he put me in contact with a historian in Laramie, Wyoming, named Bill Schrag, that was just about all things Kenny. He had been a good friend when Kenny moved back to Laramie in his later years. So that piqued my interest, and I began pondering and thinking about that. And our two boys did participate in high school basketball, and my husband enjoyed watching it. And now we've got grandkids watching and playing basketball. So I've been on the periphery of basketball for some time. And as I dug more into the story of Kenny Sailors, it was sort of like Paul Harvey of years ago. The rest
Good day.
Of the story unfolded.
Yeah, now you know the rest of the story, which I guess is sort of your punchline here. But so this is why Kenny Sailors though in particular, right? So what's how much did you know about his background in basketball, and more importantly, some of the lasting contributions, which we'll get to in a few minutes, of him, or was it just a sort of a passing understanding, and you kind of only learned as you decided to focus and dig in and do some research and all that kind of stuff?
Yeah, a little bit of both, actually. We knew that he had been involved in pro basketball and recognized that he had been a coach in Glen Allen, Alaska, and coached the basketball, both the boys and girls teams there. But there was so much I didn't know. And you're right, as I dug in, then there were so many things that unfolded, because Kenny was a pretty humble sort of a fella, and wasn't much for talking about what he had done and his claim to fame, if you will, as far as the jump shot was concerned.
Well, so as we get into sort of the timing of his career, largely his but we'll get into some of the formative part of it. But his pro playing career was roughly in the late 40s, early 1950s, and
right, 46 to 51.
Yeah, so I got to think, that's also a time that's the immediate post World War II era, right? And there is, just through just my read of history generally of the time, just of America and especially veterans coming back from the war, but frankly of a generation of males, I would argue too. There wasn't a whole lot of sort of braggadocio and boastful, and a lot of it was just getting back to work and trying to get the back to the economy going and one's families and all that kind of stuff. And it was kind of, there wasn't a whole lot of sort of, and I think frankly, and we've seen it with anytime we've talked about veterans and their service and all that kind of stuff, and families discover years, decades, maybe even after death, that some very rich, and important stories were kind of just not discussed or
right,
volunteered, if you will, right? So I wonder if a little bit of that dynamic was playing out there.
Yeah, I think that happened. And then for Kenny, because he grew up in a farming agrarian culture, that was really in his blood. And he found out that he could excel in basketball, and he learned to figure out how he could score against his older, bigger brother. So at that time in the middle 30s, about 34, Kenny and his brother were playing. Kenny was 5'7" and Bud was 6'5". So of course his older brother was always stuffing him when he was trying to make a shot. But he said, I knew I could run and I knew I could jump. And so he put that combination together, and bingo, he eventually put the ball through the hoop. And the coaches were not really crazy about that, because basketball was so different from the time that James Naismith developed it, with two hands on the ball, the two-handed set shot, feet on the floor, no dribbling. And he was ahead of his time, maybe in some ways, but I understand too that there were other men that were working on the jump shot. There was about 8 or 10 other fellas that have credit for having worked on the jump shot. But it was Bud Myers from DePaul that said in the 1940s, when he saw Kenny, he might have seen him at Madison Square Garden. But he said, Kenny Sailors may not have been the first person to shoot the jump shot, but he's the one, Myers felt, that worked and brought forward the jump shot that's in modern day basketball.
So set the tone a little bit, because during his playing days, and we'll talk about his collegiate career in Wyoming, which is obviously why he's in the College Basketball Hall of Fame. That was in the first part of the 1940s. It looks perhaps like it was interrupted by a war year, perhaps at the college or whatever. But my sense is that he was a college standout, right? Is that arguably part of why maybe he was given a little bit more credit, or a lot of credit, for helping popularize? I mean, granted, college basketball is not nearly what it is today in terms of media coverage and all that kind of stuff. But still, I suspect that he was getting some attention for his play and his championship play, and maybe bringing that jump shot into the mix, maybe more so on a platform bigger than maybe other players were getting at that time.
Yes. And the coach that he had, Everett Shelton, was new to Wyoming when Kenny started in 1939 as a freshman in college. And he had developed the Shelton weave in the offense. And so that was an innovative offensive maneuver. And when he saw Kenny working on this jump shot, he allowed him to continue to develop that. And Shelton had coached in the AAU, I'm thinking, and he had a championship team, and he wanted to coach college championship team. And what he saw with the the team in Wyoming, he thought that there would be potential there. And I don't know how he got the funding, but he said, we can't get the big name teams to come to us in Laramie, Wyoming. And the fact that the altitude is 7,200 feet there, it's a difficulty if you're not used to that. So anyway, he took the Wyoming Cowboys on a tour. And in 1942, they went around to the Midwest and a little bit to the East. And they did reasonably well. But then the next year, they really worked on that. And so Shelton established a schedule where they would be playing the big name teams on the East Coast. And so they ended up playing in Madison Square Garden 6 times, and the Cowboys won all 6 of those games. And at that time, the photographer there was a photographer that was a contract photographer for the New York Times, took a photo of Kenny Sailors up in the air about 2.5 to 3 feet off of the hardwood. And there's 7 other players, their feet are all on the floor, and Kenny's 2 feet are up in the air. And so if it would have been today, the photo would have gone viral. But that really called attention to Kenny Sailors and this jump shot.
Well, and also the Wyoming team, right, which obviously got quite a bit of attention. I mean, we're talking about at the time, obviously, it was in a previous location. I literally was just walking by it yesterday when I was in New York, the world's most famous arena, right? And it had that reputation even in its previous footprint. But in many respects, around that time, and some would even argue today, but that's a harder stretch. It was the basketball mecca of the world, really, and certainly in New York, right? Mm-hmm. So the fact that a team from way out west is coming in and they're doing so well, I mean, I gotta think he was getting a lot of new looks by people in this budding professional leagues, and maybe jealously from other college coaches at the time.
Oh, that could very well have been.
How did he get to Wyoming in the first place? I know he was living there. Was he being, I'm trying to sort of say this sort of through a modern lens here, was he being quote unquote recruited by anybody else in college basketball at the time? Or was it just Wyoming was just a natural place for him to go to college because he lived there? And this just happens to be a coach who's sort of on the come, if you will, trying to build something.
Yeah. It would be the latter part of your statement there, because Kenny grew up in Southeast Wyoming, a little way out of Cheyenne. And it was a pretty darn tough existence that he and his mother and brother lived on that farm. And his mother had been educated, and she felt that she really wanted to get her boys in a place where they could be educated too. So Kenny's brother was 5 years older than him. And when he graduated high school from Hillsdale, which is east of Cheyenne, Cora was Kenny's mother, and she said, okay, we're gonna head to Laramie. So she sold the farm and bought a house in Laramie that she ran as a boarding house for young men that were going to the University of Wyoming. So it was a natural sort of a progression that they would go to college there. So Kenny went through high school in Laramie and gained notoriety in the state for his high school play in basketball, but he gained all-state honors in football and track as well. Back in the day, they called it the broad jump. He held the state record at that time.
And describe for me the Wyoming Cowboys basketball team, because they won the NCAA basketball championship in 1943. Now, there was also the NIT at that time, and there's debate about whether but in retrospect, right, this is still the legacy of this is a team that basically was a national champion in college basketball. He was a standout player. He was named to a couple of different, I guess he was College Basketball Player of the Year in 1943. Maybe a little bit of understanding about his role there. Was he sort of like the star, or was he amongst a number of stars? And I guess curiously, as I look at the numbers here, why the gap between 1943 and 1945? Was it war induced? Was it him?
Yes.
Was it Wyoming, the team? What was going on there?
No, yeah, it was due to the war. So he was the captain of the team. He was a very organized, purposeful kind of a person. And he paid attention to what the coach said, and what the coach said he did. And he was the leader on the team. And he had sort of a natural charisma, if you will, but he was willing to set up other players to make the shots as well. And he would chuckle about, driving in, and he'd jump up in the air, and the defender thought he was going to shoot, but he'd pass it off to another guy. Often it was this Milo Komanich, and he was a tall fella. He was a center, and then he would put it in. So he was a team player and wanted to see the team do well. But when necessary, the coach would just put him in and say, go for it. Get in there and score. Don't be fiddling around, but do what you need to do. So after they won that,
would it be fair to say that he kind of was he truly introducing that jump shot to his team and maybe the teams that they were playing, right? Maybe either in parallel with what was going on elsewhere in the country, or maybe more aggressively, maybe than anybody else was.
Maybe a little more aggressively than anybody else. And as I say that, I guess I would have to add a caveat. I have not gone into the background of some of the other fellows that have done, that were noted as shooting a jump shot.
No, and I guess we're talking too.
So I focused on him.
Yeah, and I know that there are some other basketball historians, right, who kind of analyze sort of the evolution. I would also, so it's like it's almost like those ancient drawings of man, crawling first and then sort of then fully upright at the end. But I'm sure there was a little bit of that actually in this process, and it seems to me that amongst the development of this type of shot, right? I think you said it before, and I think this is where he's most credited, right? Is what people today see as clearly the motion of a true jump shot. I think a lot of people sort of attribute as a direct pathway back to what Sailors was doing, both at Wyoming and then his earnest professional career thereafter. Is that fair to say?
I would say so. Yeah, I'd agree.
What besides? So he's. I mean, this is a guy who's obviously drawing national attention, not only for the team winning the championship in 43, he's winning 2 college basketball players of the year awards in 43 and 46, numerous All-America selections and that kind of stuff. Put in context, though, he's graduating in 46, and this is still a very early stage time for this thing called professional basketball.
Right, right.
So I'm really curious as to what you might have learned about what was in his mind about this thing called professional basketball. Like, was it a legit thing? Was it a career idea of his? Did he fall into it because of his skill? Was he actively looking for a professional career? That kind of stuff. Do you have any sense of what he was thinking about to do with his life post-college?
Well, a bit, and I'm going to back up because I didn't answer your question about the gap from 43 to 46.
Oh, please. Thank you. Sorry.
So after that championship game, the war was raging, and nearly all of the team went into the military. So some of them were seniors, some of them were just a few credits short, and the university for the seniors gave them their degrees, and so they headed off to war. So Kenny had been in ROTC, and he had a girlfriend, and he went to the Marine training. And when he returned, she just was adamant that they get married, even though the chances were high he wouldn't come back. So it was a real interesting story about how that all came to pass.
And by the way, sorry, not to interrupt, but that was a very common thing in that year, actually.
Yes.
Just listened to a podcast on it's called 1 Year, and they talked about that, where the marriage rate went dramatically up for couples exactly like you're describing, that sort of get married now. I mean, you think about it in retrospect, like, okay, that might be a crazy thing to do, especially given the odds, but that was a very common thing to do around that immediate time.
Yeah. Yes, it was. So then when they ended up in San Diego, his wife met a family that she ended up staying with until Kenny shipped out. And when he was out in San Diego, they had the guys that would do sports or were basketball players. They formed a basketball team, and the Marines really gained notoriety because of Kenny Sailors and a guy named Joe Folks from Murray State in Kentucky. So they were standouts, and they were leathernecks together, and in the Marine team really had a run there for a few months as they played the different other military leagues and some of the business sponsored teams. But then a commander came in whose son had been killed in the Pacific, and he said, "So what are we doing? Playing basketball or fighting a war?" And so that put a stop to that. But during that time, Kenny and then Joe had made an impression on the teams that they were playing against with the jump shot, and others became aware of that.
And he was never deployed, right? He was still always stateside. Is that right?
No. Then shortly after that, he was deployed into the South Pacific, and he was on a troop ship. They went back and forth, delivering troops to various arenas and then picking up wounded and bringing them home. So he was actually out for between a year and a half and 2 years.
My goodness. And then he came back to play collegiately for another year, right? I guess that wasn't always guaranteed either. But I guess Wyoming, and I don't know if other colleges too welcomed him back with not only open arms, but with humility. But he picked right up then coming back.
Yes.
I mean, that says something too for one's physical traits and skill and all that stuff. And, war is war, right? So there's clear psychological scars that come with that too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that is certainly true. And when they returned to Wyoming, then there were some other returning veterans also. And their coach was just really looking forward to getting this team back together. And they did well that year. And were moving toward what they thought was a national championship. But when they got to the final games, there was something that came into question, was that the powers that be stated that Kenny and some of the other players were actually graduate students because they had gotten their degrees before they left for the war. And even though they hadn't quite finished all of their courses, the college had bestowed that degree upon them. So they were declared graduate students, and then they were ineligible for the national championship games. So that was a big disappointment. And the coach was upset for sure. But Everett Shelton was really a man of character. And he said to the team, don't complain. You don't want people calling you crybabies. So just make the best of it and keep going on. So they did. And Kenny, when he finished with that year, he had to decide whether he wanted to stay amateur and possibly try out for the Olympic team or go pro. And because he had a family by that time, he decided that he would choose professional basketball. You could make some money.
Yeah, but it wasn't probably a whole lot of money, certainly by today's standards. But
right, I think his first team was, oh gosh, I got a brain cramp.
The Cleveland Rebels of the BAA.
Yep, and Kenny said that they offered him the most most money, $7,500 for the season.
Well, in 1946 dollars, that's actually not that bad, right?
That's right. Yeah, that's right. I haven't done the math to see what it would be equated to now, but yeah, it was decent. And then away from the basketball season, then he and his wife and mother established they called it a nursing home for women in Cheyenne, and so they had that for a number of years. And then his mother kept doing that. But so in the off season they did that, and then as time went on, Kenny realized that this wasn't really where he wanted to spend the rest of his life, because his heart was back in the West and in the rural area. And one year after some connection, Rockefeller had a big lodge out near Yellowstone Park. Actually, it was near the Grand Tetons, and he was looking for somebody to manage that lodge. So he asked Kenny and his wife if they would consider that. And it was in the off season for basketball, so they were able to do that. So they did that one season, and then after the next year, 50-51, they decided that they wanted to find their own place and start a dude ranch, and then have a program for troubled boys, because Kenny had grown up without a father, with a single mother. And she was convinced she could raise boys to become men. And so she really instilled a lot of important traits in Kenny that did him well in basketball and then in business, to be a person of integrity, character, do what you said you were going to do, and follow through with it, and be that person that could be depended upon. So when he decided to retire from basketball in 1951, then they got this place out west of the Tetons in Jackson Hole, out of Jackson Hole, Wyoming, and then began a dude ranch and guide and outfitting business.
All right, what's this? Royal Retros. All right, longtime fans of this show may remember a little site that we used to promote the heck out of called 503 Sports. Well, not only are they still around, they are now known as Royal Retros. RoyalRetros.com, the king of throwbacks. And like the name implies, the highest quality jerseys and hats and apparel and all kinds of stuff related to various teams and leagues and situations that we love to obsess about here on this show. And I'm talking about getting jerseys with your name and number on the back of them, customized to your liking for the WHA or old NHL hockey teams that may not exist anymore. Perhaps it's a Federal League team from way back, or a Negro League team. Maybe you're just enamored with the various football leagues of the past, like the Arena League or the All-American Football Conference or the original UFL, United Football League. Yes, you can get all of those teams in all kinds of colors, away jerseys, home jerseys. You want to put your name on them. You want to make sure you got the official patch on the side. All of those things and more at RoyalRetros.com. And I'm not kidding, friends. You go there, you want to find that Cleveland Barons jersey to wear and show. Hey, you're maybe a Colorado Avalanche fan and you want to represent the Quebec Nordiques from where they came in the arena to show your heritage and your love and knowledge of the history of that franchise. You can do that and more. And I'm talking across football and basketball and baseball and hockey and you name it. All kinds of great stuff for you to find and buy and purchase and wear proudly from Royal Retros. That's RoyalRetros.com. And of course, we have a promo code for you. We want to save you money from all these great things. And here's that code. It's SEATS, SEATS, promo code SEATS for all of your purchases at RoyalRetros.com. Check them out. You'll be glad you did. We love them. And our friend Destin Alameda there out in Portland, Oregon, we appreciate his and their sponsorship of this show. And now, back to our conversation. I'm really curious as to what you might have learned, either eyebrow raising or whatever. I mean, this was a guy who was playing and probably excelling at a very important, although probably not at the time, but certainly in retrospect, part of the life of professional basketball, because he's playing for a team called the Cleveland Rebels out of college, and then he plays for the Chicago Stags, the Philadelphia Warriors, right, Providence, Steamrollers, all of those. Some of the Cleveland only lasted one season, for example. But the BAA, the Basketball Association of America, right, was one of the tributaries, along with this other thing called the National Basketball League, which he joined by virtue of his becoming a member of the then Denver Nuggets, right? It is around that time is when that merger actually happens, and the NBA effectively gets born around that 1950.
Yeah, 1949, wasn't it?
So I mean, it's got. I mean, I'm just curious as to. It would just seem to me that, given that, that sort of cosmic event, if you will, that merger, and then the solidification of two semi-competitive, well, actually competitive leagues, right, into this NBA in 1950 or so, and obviously not the juggernaut it is now, but it's surprising to me to look back and see how short a career he had. Why do you think he would have left it so soon, given the fact that arguably the money was only probably, and the attention was only probably going to get better?
And you're speaking to a good point. And from what I picked up, it was a matter of the heart for him. It was, his heart was back in Wyoming, and he liked that life. And being in cities and a lot of the activities that surrounded all of urban living were just foreign to him. And so he liked being in the outdoors, and he liked working with animals. He enjoyed people. He was a very personable person, and got into politics eventually. But there was something in him that wanted to move him out of all of that hullabaloo, to use a word from the book, just the activities that were foreign to what he was used to.
Yeah, I mean, I get Chicago, Philadelphia, Providence, Denver, right? Yeah. I mean, these are Boston, even. You know, these are big Eastern and Midwestern cities that are probably the diametric opposite of growing up on a farm, you know, in Wyoming or the expansive lands out west, right? Which, you know, and I guess you can take the you can't take the country out of the boy, I guess, even when he's a city slicker averaging 17 points a game with Denver in 1949-50.
Yeah, and he enjoyed that last stint with the Nuggets because he was closer to home, and he could have more home time. His wife had a lot of health problems, and so that kept her from being with him. And some of the areas where he was back on the East Coast, the elevation and the humidity, she had asthma and a lot of breathing problems. So that was an issue for them. And so the separation with his family, he didn't like that.
How much attention did he get, and how lauded was he for his play in the pros, and was this jump shot thing catching on? I have to think that during those years, others were trying to emulate what he was achieving with that shot.
Well, from what I understand, what you're saying is correct. And like anything that develops, it takes time. And from the old school coaching staff that were not in favor of that, it just took time to assimilate such a different, atypical play into, to integrate that into the game, and to really be able to embrace why that would be a positive thing to move the sport forward.
How much, I'm not looking for an actual number, but how much money do you think he made during his, maybe 5-year career? Was he able to save a bunch of dough and be able to kind of take that back with him? Or I mean, there's got to be some level besides his sort of his his sensibility of Western, life and lifestyle, right? And his value system, right? I got to think there's also probably a part of his psyche was sort of saying, hey, if I could save enough money in this process after making some pretty decent, just some decent coin playing professional basketball,
right.
He might have just felt like he had enough to do exactly that. I guess I'm scrambling to figure out where do you think he was financially in all of this? Or was this truly, just an abandonment of the pro game just to go back to the life he knew and loved?
Yeah, no, I think there's some validity to what you were saying, because he grew up in such dire circumstances. They had no money when he was a kid, before his brother graduated high school. It was a subsistence operation. They grew the food that they needed. They raised livestock to have meat. Of course, he hunted a lot of rabbits too, but he grew up in a situation where you just used it up or made it work, or you did without it. And they were frugal. And I don't know any figures as far as what his worth was by the time he left pro basketball, but the $7,500 seemed like a lot to him. So they were poking the money away, and his wife was a good money manager because she grew up with the same type of values. And there wasn't excessive living where they didn't have extras or give accounts of how they lived without running water, plumbing, or electricity until they could make things come together to have enough money for that. So to your question, how much money did he have? There would have been enough that they had set aside to ensure that they could start a business, which they did with that nursing home, and to move forward. So does that speak to your question there?
Yeah, it does. And so I guess then the other sort of question is, did he just abandon basketball altogether? I mean, did he just was he involved in the game in the years afterwards, either as, I mean, you may have hinted at the beginning, but like coaching or did he follow the game at all? Or was that just a past part of his life as he moved on to his next chapter?
That's a good question. And he did, when he returned to Wyoming, he created a barnstorming team. And there was a group of players that played. It was for a short time in that area, but he was never far from basketball when they established the Dude Ranch and the guide hunting business. Of course, they set up a basketball hoop, and he had limited contact with the sport during those times because they were out of town and away from those type of activities. But it was always in the back of his mind, and had been a part of his life. And when they moved to Alaska, then that would have been in 1965, he ended up volunteering to coach a girls basketball team and the boys basketball team then in Glen Ellen, because they didn't have a girls basketball program. And then the superintendent said, that'd be great. We just don't have money to pay you, because then Alaska was a big state with few people. I mean, it's still a big state with few people, but meaning they didn't have any extra tax revenue until, the pipeline came in then in the 70s. But he volunteered to coach the kids' programs there.
So the game was still part of his life, albeit a much smaller one in service of a different purpose, shall we say?
Right.
Okay, so let me ask this question then. Well, I got a couple of others. One in particular, why do you think, obviously he was regarded as one of college basketball's greatest, obviously being in the Hall of Fame. Why do you think, and this came up in the documentary as well, that Steph Curry helped produce, Jacob Hamilton directed, and I'll get to that in a second. But why do you think Ken Sailors not only is not an NBA Hall of Famer, or professional basketball Hall of Famer, maybe not more well known for this very crucial innovation in the modern game of basketball.
Well, there's a couple of peculiar things that I found out, and you probably know how research goes. So with that, he wasn't seeking a bunch of national acclaim. He did what he loved doing, and he enjoyed helping other people during that time. And well, actually throughout his whole life, and he really got more involved in that at the end of his life, is because he had time to do that, and there was that purpose that he had in his heart always for reaching out, helping young people. And I've read and heard from a historian in Wyoming that when he disappeared into the American wilderness for those decades, he was just kind of out of sight, out of mind. And then he was teaching school down in southeast Alaska at Angoon, which was close to Juneau. And the National Basketball, or maybe it was the Rocky Mountain, was hosting an NBA shindig, and he came into view at that time. And so then he had contacted an editor from the Anchorage Times in Alaska, Lou Friedman, who began researching Kenny Sailors and doing some articles, and he wrote about a book about Kenny. And that kind of brought him back into the limelight and picked up sort of years. And going back to when he was playing basketball for the University of Wyoming, there was another fellow named Kurt Gowdy that was a guard as well. I think he was from Rock Springs. And they played together and they cooperated, but there was always kind of a rivalry there. Excuse me. And it happened that Kurt had been dating a gal named Marilyn Corbin, and Kenny ended up sort of displacing Kurt from his position in the starting lineup of the Cowboys. And Kurt was a couple of years older than him. So there was a little bit of tension there, if you will. And
that's interesting because Kurt Gowdy, obviously a legendary broadcaster, it's ironic because he's the sportscaster award that the NBA hands out every year is named in his honor. So that's a pretty interesting little dynamic there between Messrs. Gowdy and Sailors. Did they remain friends, or was it estranged since that, that time?
I think it was probably a cordial type of a relationship. But when the move began to push Kenny forward toward the NBA Hall of Fame, all of the work that people did, and compiling all the evidence and sending it into the NBA, and nobody knows who's going to get it until that time that the decision is made. But interestingly, Kurt Gowdy was the guy in charge of the NBA at that time. And did their past have any bearing on the reason that Kenny was not selected for the NBA? It's just a question that this Bill Schrage threw out. Said, it's just kind of interesting. So Kenny was never inducted into the National Basketball Hall of Fame and the Naismith Hall of Fame, but he was inducted into the American Basketball Hall of Fame this past June 30th.
Obviously, posthumously, but there has to be, though. There has to be. I mean, especially, Steph Curry, right? Of all players, right? And all these pro sports figures now have their own media production companies and all that kind of stuff. And he's been pretty progressive and aggressive with television programs and funding this documentary on his life. I got to think that keeps, and maybe partially the reason for it, right, is keeping his name sort of out there and maybe reintroducing him to subsequent generations, so that not only is he not forgotten, but perhaps keeping that flicker of flame alive, that he finally could get that ultimate reward, right?
Yeah. Who's to say? And then at when you asked me at the beginning, just how did this all come to mind and bring this book together? Well, thinking about a person that people in this day and age, when we need people that have values and standards and will stand to encourage others and lift other people up, and using that word elevated, to bring someone up above where they are. And I just have really been thankful for the opportunity to plug into that and just say, the story of Kenny Sailors has a lot to offer an ordinary person, and especially, but to people who are involved in sports. And not that sports is everything, but there are many good aspects of sports that can help people move forward to be productive citizens and good people that will reach out and help others.
Yeah, look, and your book obviously is targeting a different audience, right? This is largely for a teenage and young adult crowd, right, if I'm not mistaken, right? And, when you compare and contrast that to the documentary that Steph Curry helped produce, right? That's obviously much more of a basketball aficionado, skill-based, players of today recognizing the contributions and how it evolved the game and that kind of stuff. So it's a multi-dimensional story, and it's interesting that you're able to present it and bring it to a younger audience that can see maybe the sort of the bigger picture, not just the 5-year pro and 5-year collegiate career of basketball, right? That he's much more than that, but obviously also too keeping that importance of his contributions to that audience as well. And maybe as they grow and become basketball fans, they'll know and look for him and his influence as they grow.
Right. And for the contribution that he made to girls basketball in Alaska, because the state legislature recognized him as developing the girls basketball program for public schools in the state of Alaska. And where we lived, near Glen Allen, one of the native corporations there was called the Otna Corporation. And there were two chiefs, Ben Neely and Fred Ewan. And Kenny got to be good friends with them for a lot of different solid connections. And I read one account that when Ben Neely was dying, the chief, Kenny Sailors was there keeping the vigil with him and his family. And Ben said to Kenny, thank you for giving the native girls of Alaska a chance to play basketball. And one of the things that Kenny said with those native girls, that boy, they were strong and they were big, but neither was he. So he could really speak to them and encourage them. And he was really proud when one of his players from Glen Allen got the jump shot down and did the right job with that. So that was exciting for him. And he worked with those high school kids to develop their jump shots.
And that's the kind of contribution, right? That's grassroots, right? That's actually building sort of the next generation of not only, male player, but also, frankly, and you arguably, not so arguably, you could make a large case for how development of that interest and that ability and that opportunity for girls and, as they get older, women to play basketball. I mean, the fruit of that labor and those seeds being sown, for efforts like that, perhaps under the radar, are blossoming now, right? With not only the collegiate game, but certainly even the professional game and even at the Olympic level, at the women's level. It's actually more, frankly, I think it's more interesting and exciting to watch than the male version many times.
Yeah. And Tim, something that I just really appreciated, and well, there were many things in that documentary that Jake Hamilton and Steph Curry did, but there was a clip in there about one of the native players from Glen Allen. Her name was Rose Charlie. And she said, I wasn't even a very good basketball player, but coach saw something in me he knew need to be developed. And she said, I appreciated that so much. And I recognized that he did that many times over the years with countless young people. And in the last chapter of the book, I recount connecting with a small town in Wyoming that Kenny got. There was a young man that needed to do a term paper or an essay for an English class. And the teacher said, let's look up. Well, they found Kenny Sailors. And that was like in 2012. So this young man looked him up and found out he was still alive. And the coach called Kenny and said, could we come visit? And he said, well, of course. So they came down to Laramie from Guernsey. And that began just a really special relationship between that school and Kenny, and how he encouraged these sports kids and the school. There was like 70 to be the keynote speaker for their spring sports event. And he said, well, of course. And so some friends hauled him up there, and he gave a keynote speech just like it was at the Hall of Fame. And those kids, when Kenny died, they were going to take unexcused absences and forfeit their basketball games to be at his funeral in the first part of February of 2016. But then the Wyoming winter hit, and all the roads were closed. It's a little tribute to Kenny from the kids of Guernsey Sunrise High School. And it was just a fitting way to bring that thread full circle, if you will, from basketball that started in a dirt corral in eastern Wyoming to these special high school kids from Guernsey Sunrise that gave him an autographed basketball of their team.
No, that's a great tribute, and a tribute, frankly, that if anybody tunes into Mountain West basketball this coming season, right, in the arena auditorium there on the campus of the University of Wyoming in Laramie, also known as the Dome of Doom. Sorry, Dome of Doom. God, I can't even. It tells you that how much I don't know. There's a beautiful statue of him that was relatively new. I think it was 2016 or so.
Yes. Yes.
Or I don't know if he got a chance to see that before his passing, but forever immortalized there. And
he did not. And
yeah, he didn't see that,
yes,
but he looks great though. That's for sure. It's a handsome looking statue.
Yeah, yeah, and that oversized number 4 jersey is hanging in the arena there. And he would always, if he was signing something for someone, he'd put Kenny Sailors number 4. And the last time I saw him was in 1983. They had come down to pick up some pack horses to take back up for their betting business, and we were visiting with them, and he gave me a little flyer that some friends had put together for him, the mimeographed highlights of his career. He said, Kenny Sailors, number 4.
All right, our thanks to Debbie, and the book is called Beyond the Jump Shot, The Elevated Life of Kenny Sailors. It is published by Clovercroft Publishing, and you can, of course, get a copy of this book in paperback or Kindle version, wherever good books are found, but of course on Amazon through our website, preferably. It's at goodseatsstillavailable.com. Search up this episode number 370 with Debbie and myself, and you will find a couple of convenient links that will take you there to said book, and we'll get a couple of shekels of referral love, of course. We'll also have a link to the movie from which we got the opening trailer / audio. That's the movie that Steph Curry produced, featuring folks like Dirk Nowitzki and Kevin Durant and Clark Kellogg and Nancy Lieberman and former Wyoming Senator Alan Simpson and many, many others, called Jump Shot, the Kenny Sailors Story. Again, that's now streaming on Prime, and we'll have a link to that too, and we'll get a shekel, maybe truly 1 or 2 shekels of referral love when you go do it through that means as well. We appreciate that. While you're on our website, before we go to our website, why don't you also bookmark and check out Debbie's website? It's called welcomingwords.com. goodseats.net. You can find out more about Debbie, her other works, the book, what she's doing, and where she's going to promote this book. Again, it's welcomingwords, all one word, .net. Again, our website, goodseatsstillavailable.com. That's where we post all of our shows if you somehow haven't gotten them in your feeds yet. By all means, give us a nice 5-star rating or review if you do, wherever you get your podcast. We appreciate that. But on our website, you'll find a couple of links to some great merch that we have. Our long-held sponsors, RoyalRetros.com, OldSchoolShirts.com, our new friends at Yinzelvania, all kinds of other stuff there for you and more to come. So check that out, why don't you? Our various social media things. We are decreasing our postings on the Twitter X thing, but you'll find us there, at least for the time being, at Good Seats Still. You will find an increasing volume of posts at both Blue Sky and Threads. We're new to Blue Sky as of this week, and Threads we've been for a couple of months now, actually. You'll find us there at Good Seats Still Available, also on Instagram, YouTube, and Facebook. I gave you the website address. Our email address, of course, is hello@goodseatsstillavailable.com. You can contact us that way as well. And our thanks, of course, as always, to the good doctor, Jerry Payne. Payne Audio Excellence. No pain this week. Nothing but smooth sailing, right, Jerry? Yeah, sure. And we appreciate, as always, his help in producing and putting together the various bits and pieces of this show. Thank you, of course, for listening. We cannot appreciate it enough. Let us know how you like the show, what you'd like to hear more of. We got lots more stuff coming at your podcast feeds in the weeks and months to come. And we're going to try to blow this out a little bit. We're going to try to add some more content, not just audio content, but also some newsletter stuff. There's so much going on in the realms of smaller and fledgling sports and teams that are relocating or not sure where they're going, and remembrances of teams and stuff, and unearthing of stories. And that we just don't think once a week on an audio podcast is going to be enough to keep up with. So we're going to try to go a little bit deeper with it, and hopefully you'll come along with us for that ride. And stay tuned to your feeds, etc., and more to come on that. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next week.